East Idaho Newsmakers is brought to you by the Bank of Commerce, your bank of a lifetime.
This is East Idaho Newsmakers with Nate Eaton.
Welcome to East Idaho Newsmakers. We are pleased to have Miranda Marquit with us today. Did I say your last name right? All right, good. Now, she is the chairman of the Bonneville County Democratic Central Committee, and she has been actively involved in politics most of your life.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been political and politically minded for since I was a teenager. But yeah, I've only started just getting really more active in the last few years. And
what led to that increase of activity?
Most of it was because my son finally got old enough for me to be able to kind of work on this a little bit. When he entered middle school, that's when I decided that I could take a little more time to work on this passion of mine, which is politics.
So the big question that a lot of people may have is, we're in conservative East Idaho. The Republican Party is very popular and a lot of people follow. What is it like to be actively involved in the Democratic Party in a highly conservative area?
It's an interesting and fun challenge. I mean, I grew up in a family that is predominantly Republican as well. So I have always been surrounded by that kind of Republican or conservative mindset. But, you know, my parents also instilled in me a great desire to find things out for myself, to think critically for myself, and to come to my own conclusions. And I really like that. And so that kind of pushed me in my own personal life to identify more with a progressive side of things rather than a more conservative side of things. But yeah, it is kind of challenging in this area to be labeled a Democrat as opposed to Republican. Although when you get right down to it and you look at local Idaho values, because, you know, we are all Idahoans, and when you look at local Idaho values, you find that the labels Republican, Democrat, conservative, progressive, whatever it is, when you look at those labels and you get right down to it, they don't say much about Idahoans, because Idahoans are Idahoans, and a lot of the time we have very similar values. So even though my parents and I may have like different labels put on us, a lot of the time our values and those underlying desires for what we want in a better community are the same.
So what was it? You said you started to explore and consider and think about different issues. What was it about the progressive ideals and ideas that you liked rather than the conservative ideas?
I just like moving forward in general. As a human being and as a species and as a community and as a country, I just like the idea of moving forward and changing and growing. And to me, those just kind of went hand in hand with a progressive bent, I guess. Moving forward and embracing more people, embracing more paths, and you know, trying to include more people. And to me, that just kind of called to me. And that's just kind of been my path.
As the chair of the Bonneville County Democratic Committee, how active is the committee? Do you have a lot of people, you know, involved with your group?
Yeah, interestingly, we've about doubled in size since November, which has been kind of a fun thing. And we have been working a lot with the Idaho Falls Progressives, which is a different group, which is not affiliated with us. They are completely different, but we have been doing some, you know, crossover work with them, and that's been great. But yeah, we've been seeing an uptick in interest and also involvement, and we've been kind of ramping up the activities we've been doing lately.
I remember you came in on election night.
Oh, yes.
Before the ballots were counted and before we knew who was going to win, and you obviously hoped that Hillary Clinton would win. What was your reaction 6 or 7 hours later when you realized that she didn't?
It was kind of a bummer, but once again, I think we have you know, a great system of government and a great nation. We can always improve. Once again, that's, you know, my belief that as humans we're always moving forward and improving upon ourselves. But we do have systems in place, and so you know, I didn't think it was the end of the world, and I still don't think it's the end of the world. And I think that night too, I talked to you about my passion for local politics. And locally, I think there's a whole lot more we can do in our own communities rather than worrying about things that we can't really change all the time. at the top. But it was very heartening. There were a couple of things too. One of the things that was a little disheartening about that night was looking at the voter turnout, which nationally continues to inch downward toward 50%. Idaho beats the odds there, which is nice. It's nice to know that Idaho in general has a better citizenry, citizen involvement than the rest of the country. So it was kind of disappointing to look at that voter turnout inch down, and then of course a few days later when you look at the popular vote and realize that maybe less than 30% of the voting public has voted for our president, that is a little bit disconcerting when you think about the fact that we are putting somebody with less than 30% of the voting populace between the low voter turnout and the popular vote is leading the country. And that is kind of disconcerting, but once again, that goes back to our systems, and maybe we can look at that in the future. But as always, local politics is my true passion, and that's something that I focus on more than what's going on nationally.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the big local issues that you think the public is unaware of, or maybe they're aware of, but they should care a little bit more about?
Well, honestly, I think that it's not so much the public being aware of it as our representatives in Boise listening to us. One of the things I've noticed over the last couple of years, since I grew up here, but I moved back a couple of years ago, one of the things I've noticed is that even though the public requests movement on things like healthcare and education, our representatives in Boise are slow to heed what the public wants. And so I find it very interesting. I think as far as what Idahoans are interested in, which is healthcare, education, we're very interested in our public lands and how our access to public lands is preserved and utilized. I think all of those things are things that our public is very aware of. And, but I think that what we kind of miss out on is that our representatives in Boise don't always listen to our voices. And
why do you think that is?
Because they're comfortable. They're comfortable with where they're at. They're comfortable in the idea that they'll be reelected no matter what they do. And I think that's unfortunate because it doesn't challenge them and make them really think about it and talk to their constituents. So yeah, interestingly enough, one of the people I've been very impressed with since he started was Brian Zollinger. And even though ideologically speaking and on some of the issues we don't really agree on a lot, I have been very impressed with how responsive he is, and how if you write him a letter, he'll send you a personal response rather than just some sort of canned email, and how he really thoughtfully looks at things. I think a lot of the representatives that have been in there for a long time just assume that, well, they're incumbents, they're comfortable, they can vote whatever way they want, and they don't have to worry about re-election because they'll just be automatically put back in. And I think that's unfortunate. So I think really, as Idahoans, as people who pride themselves as being independent thinkers, I would really like to see us as a whole step back away from labels, step back away from what letters behind somebody's name, and really look at what they're doing and what they're doing for us and for the state, and really thinking about, are they listening to us? Are they listening to what we want for our state? And if they're not, maybe it's time to start thinking about other ways to get them to listen to us, rather than just putting them back in there.
There's so many people that agree with that, and that just get beyond caring. They don't care anymore. Right. It's too messy. Politics nationwide, locally, statewide. They tune out. How do you reach out to those people and say, no, it really is important?
I think that the best thing we can do is just give them a place to make their voices heard by somebody, and let them know that there is somebody working and trying. And it can be very disappointing, as you mentioned earlier, kind of being like the minority party, or being in, having that position. It feels like an uphill battle, and there are days I wake up in the morning and say, why am I doing this? But it is important work, I think, and I think that it's important to have a healthy opposition. And so, but I think as far as inviting people, one of the things we started doing as Bonneville County Democrats is holding issues town halls. And we're not talking about, talking about individual politicians, we're talking about issues. And we had town halls where we've had people come in their neighborhoods, and we've been holding them in neighborhoods at elementary schools, where people can come and say, okay, these are the things I want to talk about. They put a little sticky note up by the issues they want to talk about, and we tackle the top two. So we've had some that deal with healthcare, because there were a lot of people who were interested in that. We've had people want to talk about education, and we've had people want to talk about some of these other issues, including public lands. So we sit down and we give them space to come up, and it's not just us talking to them. We say, come up and tell us your thoughts. And I've got notes. I've got pages of notes from these town halls where I've just listened, where we've given, like it's open mic, and you get 2 minutes, or was it 1 minute? Anyway, you get 1 or 2 minutes, and you come up and you say, this is the issue that is affecting me and why, and then we kind of break out a little bit and talk about solutions and what maybe we can do, or what we might want to kind of move forward as far as policy. And so I think inviting people to actually have their voices heard and talk about what matters to them can get them involved, because I think a lot of what happens is people just feel like nobody's listening to them. And I think local politics really should be about listening to our local citizens.
And those that might not agree with you.
That too. And we did. We had people at the town hall who had plenty of things to say that we didn't agree. But you know what? I wrote it down anyway, because I think it is important to realize that even though sometimes what we prioritize is different, and sometimes the way we get there, like how we get from point A to point B, might be different. In the end, we're all Idahoans, and we have very similar values. So we may have different ways of getting there, or different priorities. And so, yeah, so we did. We had people who disagreed with us, and we definitely wrote that stuff down. And because, I think compromise is a big part of it.
We're going to take a quick break here. When we come back, I want to talk about the future of the Democratic Party, and a lot more. We'll be right back after this brief message.
At the Bank of Commerce, we understand the hard work, determination, and sacrifice it takes to run a successful business. That's why we're here every step of the way to help make your dreams come true. The Bank of Commerce, your bank of a lifetime.
Welcome back to East Idaho Newsmakers. We are pleased to have Miranda Marquit with us today. She is the chairman of the Bonneville County Democratic Committee. Central Committee. The Bonneville County Democratic Central Committee. There we go.
It's a mouthful, I know.
A lot of words in there. So you've been the chairman for how long?
So I was put in as the interim chair in March 2015, and then confirmed during a reorganization in May of 2015. So a little more than a year.
What's your group's objective? I mean, what's the whole purpose? Why exist?
Right, so the objective of the Bonneville County Democrats is to advocate for a compassionate and responsible government here locally and at a state level. So we're working toward policies that are more inclusionary, and also policies that are responsible, because you can be responsible and compassionate at the same time. And so we're really kind of working to do that. And then also another goal that I am interested in seeing is kind of raising the profile of Democrats and also progressive ideas and policies here in Idaho, just because I do think that, I'm not a huge fan of the two-party system, but I think a one-party system is worse, and I think that kind of a super majority where one party has such huge influence kind of leads to stagnation of thought. It leads to maybe policies that aren't great because you're kind of stuck in this rut. And when you talk about this on a corporate level, they talk about groupthink, and they've done studies on groupthink on a corporate level. And it really does stifle creativity, innovation, and a business's ability to move forward. And I think that applies at in state governance as well. When you have one way of thinking that predominates, you kind of lose sight of moving forward in innovation and new creative solutions. And so one of the things I would like to see, and that we're kind of working toward, is raising the profile of the Democrats here in Idaho, so that we do have a strong kind of opposition to the supermajority.
So you talk about groupthink. As a Democrat, do you feel represented in Boise? As a Democrat in Idaho, do you feel represented? I mean, is there legislation where you're like, we really should fight against this or for this, but there's no way it's going to go anywhere?
Yeah, definitely. And you kind of get that feeling of futility a little bit. I think Medicaid expansion has been a really good example. Just because, we talk about every year, people are like, well, what are the Democrats doing about this? And it's like, well, we're trying, but there's not a lot we can do about it. But you still get up there and fight, and you still raise that profile. So, I think affordable health care is one of those big issues that we kind of struggle with here in Idaho, especially with tens of thousands of people uninsured, with the fate of whatever's next uncertain. That is a huge issue, I think, that our representatives in Boise, even though polls indicate that most citizens want to see it, and it's not just as a Democrat, it's as an Idahoan, they just keep kicking that can down the road. And I think that's one of the big issues that is really kind of frustrating, this issue of, well, how can we get access to more affordable health care for more Idahoans. So there are some issues like that where you kind of feel a little stymied as you go along, but in the end, once again, I think, just moving forward and, keep trying and keep raising our voices.
Now, there's a lot of talk that millennials, Gen Xers, are losing touch with politics. They just don't care. How do you foresee that as a problem with the Democratic Party, locally and nationally?
So I actually see it as an opportunity, mainly because Gen Xers, I'm an old, I'm a young Gen Xer / old millennial. I'm like right there.
Right on the border, yeah.
What I see is they're not losing an interest in politics. And as we saw in the last election, and the great surge in interest in Bernie Sanders, they're not disconnected from politics. They're disconnected from political parties. And I think that's a very big difference. And I think the challenge of the future is building broad-based coalitions and not necessarily trying to force them into a party. As I've said before, I'm not a huge proponent of the two-party system. I do align more with Democrats than I do with Republicans, but I think trying to boil it down and trying to force them to choose between two parties they're not interested in is a mistake. And I think the key is engaging people where they are. And we see a lot of young people are interested. We created, after last November and the upsurge in interest, we had to create new committees, like subcommittees under us. And we have chairs of those who are new and they are young and they weren't involved before. We had a young lady run for school board over in Ammon. Obviously they're nonpartisan, but she got interested in it because she came through our system. And so, I've made plenty of connections with young people who are interested in helping out. And they will come and help out. They may not register as a Democrat, but they'll come help out, and I'm hoping in November they'll come out and vote. And so I'm more interested in seeing them engaged as citizens and engaged in the voting process and engaged in activism and moving forward than I am about party affiliation. And so I think there's a definite difference between interest in party and interest in politics, especially local politics. At the local level, and this is going to get me in so much trouble, but at the local level, I'm not super interested in whether or not they're registered. I mean, I would like to see more precinct captains, so come on out and be a precinct captain, and you do have to register to be a precinct captain. But there are definitely people who have not registered as Democrats, and they are young people who are coming out and helping us out with our social media, with our town halls. We've got a quality of life fair coming up in October. They're helping with that. So there are definitely young people interested in being engaged. They just don't want to be told they have to accept the label of one of the two major parties.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about being disenfranchised with the party. Do you think that's why Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were so popular? That wasn't a traditional Democrat or a traditional Republican.
Yeah, I really do kind of think that a little bit. I think in terms of, I do. Like I said, local politics is my passion beyond national politics. But yes, I definitely think that there's this sort of movement toward this outsider and this interest in, the traditional way we've been doing things, this two-party system, hasn't been helping us a whole ton. And so yes, I definitely think that this sort of move to look for an outsider or move to look for somebody who's kind of bucking the trend a little bit, or somebody who is getting back to as far as Donald Trump is concerned, I don't know how much I'd call him a true conservative. But as far as Bernie Sanders is concerned, he drew a lot of people because it went back to that whole youth idea toward what they thought of as real progressivism. And I think the Democrats do represent progressivism, but I think that there are a lot of people who thought that maybe it could be represented better.
Do you think Bernie would have beat Donald Trump if he was the candidate?
That's a really interesting question that I'm not sure about the answer to. Because once again, we got caught up in this whole, the way districts are run and the way the Electoral College works and all of that. Because once again, you look at the popular vote, and for the second time in 16 years, the person who won the popular vote did not win the Electoral College. And so, and then when you look at the demographics of the areas that, the states, the electoral votes that Donald Trump won, that Hillary Clinton lost, that she shouldn't have lost, when you look at the demographics there, and compare that to what Bernie Sanders was polling in, I am not sure that the Obama coalition would have come out for Bernie Sanders. So I don't know. The answer to that is I don't know. I think that he probably might have encouraged more young people to get out instead of stay at home. I don't know if it would have been enough.
It's a race that I'm sure will be studied for years and years.
I know. It's a political scientist's dream.
Exactly. And then the next election maybe as well. Let's talk about the future of the party. Where do you see the Democratic Party locally and nationally in 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, nationally, I'm not sure. So locally, I actually see some pretty solid growth in terms of maybe not necessarily numbers on the rolls, but in terms of people who are interested and associated and becoming more engaged, I see some growth. I definitely see growth here locally and on a state level, just because I think especially after this election, especially after that whole outsider thing, I think people are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, how can I make my voice heard and where can I get involved? And like I said, after November, we saw a huge, we've doubled the people who are involved with us. And so I see that continuing as long as we can provide a place for them to go so that they can do something and feel like they are moving forward. So as long as we can do that, I think that would be great. I think on the national level, the Democratic National Party really needs to get back in touch with the people. I think part of the issue lately, and a lot of people have said this as well, it's not like I'm out here offering news, but
we'll take it if you got some.
But yeah. I think they need to get back to looking to how listening to their members and saying, okay, well, what do we want and what are our priorities? And I think one of the things that's missing from not just the Democrats on a national level, but national politics in general is we are no longer talking about priorities. We're no longer sitting and saying, well, let's have a national conversation about our priorities as a nation and as a society. What matters to us? We've been so caught up in the name calling. And I think bringing that back down to the local level, when we can talk about Idaho values and we can talk about Idaho priorities and what matters to us and what we need to move forward with, I think that's where we need to be starting these conversations rather than starting with, you did this and you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, oh my gosh. I think instead of starting with those ideological positions, we need to get back to having an actual conversation about what are our priorities. And then once we can figure that out and stop being distracted by everything else, then we can start talking about, well, okay, how do we achieve these priorities, which is something we haven't really done. And I think if, as Democrats, if we can kind of seize that back and stop reacting all the time to finger pointing and you're a liberal and it's your fault and emails this and Donald Trump's Twitter, and if we can stop pointing at those things and get back to, well, let's talk about our priorities and how we can make those things happen for a better city, a better county, a better state, and a better nation, I think we'll be in a better spot. So I think really that's the Democrats' way forward, is to stop reacting and screaming about Donald Trump all the time and saying, well, no, wait, let's talk about our priorities as people rather than what everybody else is doing.
Well, thank you so much for coming in, Miranda.
Thank you for having me.
Miranda Marquit, she is the chairman of the Bonneville County Democratic Central Committee. We appreciate you coming in and telling us your story and why you're so involved with politics. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week for another East Idaho Newsmakers.
East Idaho Newsmakers is brought to you by the Bank of Commerce, your bank of a lifetime.